My mother-in-law started showing up to my doctor appointments without being invited, contradicting everything I told the doctor about my symptoms. When I confronted my husband about it, he said, "She knows you better than any doctor ever could." So, I recorded everything and exposed how she was sabotaging my medical care. I'm Victoria, a 29-year-old high school chemistry teacher married to Brandon, a software engineer, for 4 years. His mother, Patricia, is a retired nurse who's always been overly involved in Brandon's life. But I thought that was just how their family worked. 8 months ago, I started experiencing weird health issues, dizziness, nausea, a racing heart, and splitting headaches that lasted hours. At first, I thought it was work stress, but the symptoms got worse and started happening on weekends, too. I made an appointment with my primary care doctor, Dr. Chen, who I'd been seeing for 3 years. She immediately started running tests, blood work, EKG, and referred me to a cardiologist because she was concerned about the heart palpitations. I mentioned the appointments to Patricia during a casual phone call, and she immediately started playing amateur doctor, telling me my symptoms sounded like anxiety or low blood sugar and that I probably just needed to eat better instead of running to doctors for every little thing. My first follow-up appointment with Dr. Chen was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in the waiting room when Patricia walked through the front door. I was completely confused because I had no idea why she would be there. She acted like it was totally normal, saying she decided to come support me because she knew I was worried about test results. When I asked how she knew about my appointment, she said Brandon had mentioned it and she'd looked up the address online. When they called my name, Patricia stood up with me like she was obviously coming along. I told her I preferred to handle medical appointments privately, but she insisted she had medical experience and might help me remember important questions. I felt uncomfortable but didn't want to cause a scene, so I reluctantly let her come into the exam room. That appointment was a disaster. Dr. Chen asked how I'd been feeling, and I started describing how the symptoms had gotten worse. But before I could finish, Patricia jumped in and contradicted everything I said. When I mentioned the headaches were more frequent, Patricia interrupted, saying I told her they were getting better and were probably from not drinking enough water. When I explained the heart palpitations happened even at rest, Patricia said, "I've been very stressed at work and probably just needed relaxation techniques." Every single symptom I described, Patricia would minimize or completely contradict, referencing conversations we'd supposedly had that never happened. Dr. Chen kept looking between us with confusion, clearly trying to figure out why my mother-in-law was contradicting my own symptom reports. When Dr. Chen asked about family medical history, Patricia started providing information about Brandon's family instead of mine, going on about how they'd always been healthy people who didn't need doctors for every little issue. By the end, I felt like Dr. Chen hadn't gotten accurate information about what I was experiencing. After the appointment, I told Patricia I appreciated her concern but preferred to handle medical care independently. She got hurt and said she was just trying to help with her medical training and that patients sometimes exaggerate when they're anxious. That evening, I told Brandon what happened. Instead of being understanding, he got defensive and said his mother was just trying to be helpful, and I was being ungrateful. He said, "Patricia has years of medical experience and probably has valuable insights for your diagnosis." When I pointed out she'd contradicted almost everything I said about my own symptoms, Brandon said, "Sometimes patients aren't reliable sources about their conditions, and having an outside perspective could be beneficial." 2 weeks later, I had a cardiology appointment. I specifically didn't mention it to Patricia and only told Brandon the day before, asking him not to share details because I wanted to handle it alone. He agreed. But when I arrived, Patricia was already in the waiting room. She explained she'd called Brandon that morning to check on me, and when he mentioned the appointment, she decided to provide moral support because specialist appointments could be anxiety-provoking. I was furious but again felt trapped. I told Patricia I'd be going in alone, but she said she'd already checked in as my medical advocate, and the staff said family members were welcome. The cardiology appointment was even worse. Dr. Martinez was trying to get a detailed history of my palpitation episodes, asking about triggers, duration, and severity. Every time I started describing an episode, Patricia interrupted with corrections that completely changed the information. When Dr. Martinez asked about patterns, I said they seemed random, but Patricia said I told her they mostly happened when I was anxious about work. When he asked about severity, I said they were intense and concerning, but Patricia said I was a worrier and they probably seemed worse than they were. Dr. Martinez looked confused and asked if Patricia was my mother. When I explained she was my mother-in-law, he asked if she'd witnessed episodes firsthand. She admitted she hadn't, but said she had medical training and was helping me track symptoms. He asked to speak with me privately. Once alone, I gave him accurate information without interruptions. Based on my actual symptoms, he ordered a Holter monitor at a follow-up appointment. He mentioned it was unusual for family members to contradict patient reports and asked if I was comfortable with my mother-in-law's involvement. I told him honestly I was uncomfortable but was struggling with boundaries without causing family conflict. Dr. Martinez said patients had the right to privacy and could note in my file that I preferred attending appointments alone. When Patricia returned, Dr. Martinez explained the Holter monitor plan. She immediately questioned if testing was necessary and suggested symptoms might resolve with lifestyle changes. He firmly explained cardiac symptoms should always be properly evaluated. That evening, I had another conversation with Brandon about his mother's interference. His response was even more frustrating. He said his mother had been a nurse for 30 years and probably knew more than most doctors. He said maybe I should listen to her advice instead of getting defensive and that she was probably right about me overthinking symptoms. When I pointed out she hadn't witnessed my symptoms and was contradicting my reports to medical professionals, Brandon said patients aren't always reliable reporters, especially when anxious. He actually said, "She knows you better than any doctor ever could, and she's been taking care of people's health problems for decades. Maybe you should trust her judgment instead of shopping around for doctors who will tell you what you want to hear." I was stunned. My husband was suggesting I was doctor shopping and that his mother's contradictions were more reliable than my own experience. I realized I needed to start documenting what was happening. Update 1. I scheduled my follow-up with Dr. Martinez for the Holter results, telling Brandon I'd attend alone and not to share information with his mother. He seemed annoyed but agreed. The day of the appointment, I arrived early and was relieved Patricia wasn't there. But 10 minutes before my time, she walked in looking flustered, saying Brandon had mentioned the appointment that morning and she'd rushed over. I told her directly that I'd asked Brandon not to share this information, and I'd be attending alone. She got hurt and confused, saying families should support each other and she was just trying to be a good mother-in-law. Then she said something revealing, "I just don't want you to exaggerate your symptoms or make the doctor think there's something seriously wrong when it's probably just anxiety. You tend to overthink things and I don't want you on unnecessary medications." This was the first time she'd been so explicit about believing I was exaggerating symptoms. She wasn't trying to be helpful. She was actively trying to minimize my health concerns. I told the front desk I'd attend alone, and they noted it in my file. When called, Patricia tried to follow, but the nurse said only I was expected. Dr. Martinez reviewed the Holter results. The test had captured several episodes of irregular heart rhythm correlating with my noted symptoms. I had premature ventricular contractions, PVCs, causing the palpitations and dizziness. He said, while PVCs are often benign, the frequency and pattern suggested further investigation to rule out underlying cardiac issues. He referred me to an electrophysiologist for specialized testing and prescribed medication for the irregular rhythms. Dr. Martinez was glad we'd done testing because my symptoms were definitely real and measurable, not anxiety-related like some might have suggested. When I came out, Patricia immediately asked what the doctor said. After I gave her a brief summary, her response was exactly what I'd expected. She said PVCs were common and usually not serious, and the doctor was probably being overly cautious with expensive testing. When I told Brandon about the diagnosis, instead of being supportive, he said his mother had been right about stress-related symptoms since PVCs could be triggered by anxiety. I tried explaining Dr. Martinez said they were significant enough for further evaluation, but Brandon said doctors often overtreat to make money. I realized no matter what medical evidence I presented, Brandon would side with his mother over actual professionals. I decided to start recording conversations to document the behavior pattern. The next incident happened at my electrophysiologist appointment with Dr. Kim. I hadn't told Brandon or Patricia about it, but somehow Patricia found out and showed up. This time, I had my phone ready and recorded the entire interaction. Patricia again contradicted my symptom reports, minimized concerns, and tried convincing Dr. Kim that testing was unnecessary because I was young and healthy and probably just needed stress management. Dr. Kim was clearly frustrated and asked her to leave so he could get accurate information. During the private portion, he explained my PVC pattern could be serious and wanted an echocardiogram and stress test. He said family members contradicting patient reports was highly unusual and concerning, asking if I felt safe in my medical care. I told him about Patricia's interference and Brandon's lack of support. Dr. Kim said patients had the right to receive care without family interference and could document that I preferred attending appointments alone. When Patricia returned, Dr. Kim explained additional testing. She immediately questioned the necessity and suggested home monitoring instead. Dr. Kim was direct, saying cardiac arrhythmias required proper evaluation and medical decisions should be between patient and physician without family input. That evening, I played Brandon recordings of his mother's contradictions and interference. Instead of being concerned, he got angry at me for recording his mother without permission, saying I was being sneaky and trying to make her look bad. When I pointed out the recording showed exactly what I'd been telling him, Brandon said his mother was just advocating for me to prevent overtreatment by money-motivated doctors. He said, "She knows you better than any doctor ever could, and she's just trying to protect you from unnecessary procedures. You should be grateful someone cares enough to question whether all this testing is really needed." I realized Brandon would never support me against his mother, regardless of evidence. I needed to take more drastic action. Update 2. I scheduled a meeting with Dr. Chen to discuss Patricia's ongoing interference. I brought printed transcripts of recordings and a timeline of incidents where Patricia had contradicted symptom reports or questioned medical recommendations. Dr. Chen was appalled. In 30 years of practice, she'd never seen family members so consistently undermine patient care. She said Patricia's behavior was dangerous because it could prevent proper diagnosis and treatment. Dr. Chen noted in my file that I preferred attending appointments alone and said her office wouldn't allow Patricia at future appointments unless specifically requested. If Patricia continued showing up uninvited, they'd consider it harassment and involve security. Dr. Chen asked if I'd let her use my situation as an educational example for medical students about family interference in healthcare. I agreed, and she said she'd anonymize details but use recordings and the timeline to show students how family dynamics can negatively impact medical care. Next, I addressed the situation with Brandon's family. I created a detailed document with a timeline, recording excerpts, and explanations of how Patricia's behavior interfered with my medical care. I sent this to Brandon's father, sister, and brother. The response was immediate. Brandon's father called within hours, furious about Patricia's behavior. He said he'd had no idea she was attending appointments uninvited or contradicting symptom reports, calling her behavior completely inappropriate. Brandon's sister was equally shocked and supportive, saying she'd noticed Patricia becoming increasingly controlling, but this level of medical interference was beyond anything she'd imagined. Brandon's brother was most direct, saying Patricia's behavior was abusive, and Brandon needed to choose between supporting his wife's health and enabling his mother's control. All three said they'd have serious conversations with both Patricia and Brandon, and promised to support me in setting boundaries. The real confrontation happened at dinner at Patricia's house the following weekend. I didn't want to attend, but Brandon insisted his mother wanted to clear the air. I agreed, but brought my phone to record. The dinner was a disaster. Patricia immediately talked about being hurt by my sudden hostility toward her helpful efforts. She said she'd only been supportive and couldn't understand why I was being secretive and defensive about family help. I let her talk, then started playing recording excerpts of her contradicting my symptoms and questioning doctors' recommendations. Patricia went white, hearing her own voice, minimizing my cardiac symptoms and suggesting doctors were overtreating me. Brandon's father was furious, telling Patricia her behavior was inappropriate and potentially dangerous, and she needed to stay out of my medical care completely. Patricia got defensive and started crying, saying she was using her medical experience to help me get better care. She'd seen young women misdiagnosed with anxiety when they had hormonal or lifestyle issues and was trying to prevent overmedication. Brandon's sister pointed out Patricia hadn't practiced in 15 years, and medical knowledge had changed significantly. Even if intentions were good, her methods were inappropriate and harmful. The most shocking moment came when Patricia admitted what I'd suspected. She said she didn't think my symptoms were as serious as I was making them out to be and was worried I was developing hypochondriac tendencies and becoming too dependent on medical attention. She actually said, "Victoria has always been a bit dramatic and attention-seeking, and I was concerned she was exaggerating symptoms to get sympathy and attention from doctors and family." The room went silent. When Brandon's father asked her to repeat it, she tried backtracking, but I played the recording of her saying almost the same thing to Dr. Martinez about me being a worrier who makes symptoms seem worse. Brandon's brother looked at Brandon and said, "Do you hear what your mother just said about your wife? She's calling Victoria a liar and hypochondriac, and you've been supporting her and undermining Victoria's medical care." Brandon finally spoke up, and his response was worse than expected. He said his mother had valid concerns about me becoming too focused on medical issues and maybe there was truth to me overthinking symptoms. He said, "Mom has medical training and experience, and she's trying to make sure Victoria doesn't get caught up in unnecessary testing. Sometimes patients do exaggerate symptoms, and it's good to have someone objective." Brandon's father looked disgusted, saying, "Your wife has been diagnosed with a cardiac condition by multiple doctors, and instead of supporting her, you're suggesting she's making it up for attention. What kind of husband does that?" The evening ended with Brandon's family basically disowning both him and Patricia. His father said they were no longer welcome at family gatherings until they apologized and changed behavior, and siblings said they were ashamed to be related to people who treat family health concerns so callously. Brandon was furious with me for embarrassing his mother and causing family drama, but I told him I was done protecting people actively undermining my health and well-being. The fallout was immediate. Within 24 hours, I'd received supportive calls from multiple extended family members appalled by Patricia's behavior and Brandon's support of it. Brandon's aunt, a registered nurse, was particularly outraged, saying Patricia's behavior violated every principle of patient advocacy and medical ethics, and using her nursing background to justify undermining medical care was a disgrace to the profession. Several family members shared stories about Patricia's controlling behavior over the years, and I realized this pattern wasn't new or specific to me. Brandon doubled down on supporting his mother, saying I'd humiliated someone just trying to help and was tearing apart his family over minor medical appointments. When I pointed out his mother had admitted thinking I was a hypochondriac exaggerating for attention, Brandon said maybe she had a point. I made an appointment with a marriage counselor, hoping a neutral party could help Brandon understand how damaging his behavior was. The session was a complete disaster. Brandon spent most of the time defending his mother's intentions and suggesting I was oversensitive. When the counselor asked how he'd feel if my mother attended his appointments and contradicted his doctors, Brandon said that would be different because my mother didn't have medical training. When asked about recordings where Patricia called me dramatic and attention-seeking, Brandon said maybe his mother's concerns weren't entirely wrong and I had been getting pretty focused on medical issues. The counselor was shocked, explaining that supporting a spouse's medical care was a basic marriage requirement and undermining health concerns was emotional abuse. She said family interference without permission was a serious boundary violation and Brandon's support enabled the abuse. Brandon got angry, saying the counselor was being dramatic and nobody was being abused. When asked if he trusted me to accurately report my symptoms, Brandon hesitated before saying, "Patients aren't always reliable sources about their conditions." That's when I knew the marriage was over. My husband had just told a therapist he didn't trust me to report my own health symptoms and thought his mother's opinions were more valid than my experiences. I told Brandon I wanted separation while figuring out if I could stay married to someone who'd side with his mother against my health. He said I was overreacting and time apart would help me gain perspective. I moved in with my sister and felt better than I had in months. The constant stress of having health concerns minimized was gone, and I could focus on following doctors' recommendations without interference. My medical care improved dramatically. The electrophysiologist completed testing and determined my PVCs were caused by a structural issue correctable with a minor procedure. The procedure was successful, and symptoms resolved within weeks. Dr. Kim said, if you'd followed Patricia's advice to avoid testing, the condition could have worsened and caused serious complications. Patricia's interference hadn't just been inappropriate, it had been dangerous. Her attempts to convince me and the doctors that symptoms weren't serious could have prevented necessary treatment. It's been 6 months since separation, and the divorce was finalized last month. Brandon continued insisting I was overreacting and his mother was just trying to help. He sent long emails about how hurt his mother was by my attacks and how drama could have been avoided if I'd been more appreciative. Brandon tried convincing me to try different counseling, saying the first therapist was biased and we needed someone more understanding of his mother's medical background and helpful intentions. I declined because Brandon was fundamentally unable to prioritize my well-being over his mother's feelings. He was so enmeshed with Patricia, he couldn't see how her behavior was harmful, even with clear evidence and professional opinions. Patricia has been telling everyone I broke up her son's marriage because I couldn't handle having a caring mother-in-law who tried to help with medical care. She's painting herself as a victim of my selfishness and ingratitude. But the truth is documented in hours of recordings and medical records. Several of Brandon's family members have cut contact with both him and Patricia because they're disgusted by their behavior and refusal to take responsibility. My health has been excellent since the cardiac procedure. The PVCs are completely resolved, and I haven't had symptoms in months. Dr. Kim said early detection and treatment were crucial for success, and delaying could have required more invasive interventions or caused permanent damage. I'm now in a healthy relationship with a fellow teacher named Michael, who's supportive and respectful of my autonomy and health decisions. When I told him about my experiences, he was horrified and said he couldn't imagine treating a partner that way. The most important thing I learned is to trust yourself when you know something's wrong with your health, even when people around you are minimizing concerns. You have the right to receive medical care without interference from family members who think they know better. Patricia used her nursing background to justify controlling behavior, but her actions had nothing to do with medical knowledge and everything to do with control and power. Brandon's inability to set boundaries and prioritize his wife's well-being showed he wasn't capable of being a true marriage partner. To anyone dealing with similar interference, you have the right to attend medical appointments alone, receive care without family interference, and have your symptom reports believed and respected. Document everything. Record conversations if necessary. And don't be afraid to involve medical professionals in setting boundaries. You deserve health care providers who listen to you, family members who respect your autonomy, and partners who support your well-being. Don't settle for anything less. Okay, viewers, time to read and see what the viewers had to say about this one. This one only has one comment and it says, "Girl, you dodged a massive bullet by divorcing Brandon." A man who won't stand up for his wife's health because mommy might get upset? That's not a husband. That's a mama's boy who never grew up. You deserve so much better.